May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I love my children, but their taste in literature can be a bit uninspired at times. Sometimes I think if I have to read Goodnight Moon one more time, I'm going to scream. I've said goodnight to the moon and the room and the bears and the chairs and the kittens and, yes, the mittens more times than I care to count. It's a delightful book, but after reading it for the 100th time, some of the magic has been lost. Reading those same lines over and over, you can become numb to them. And I think one of the challenges of preaching on passages like the one we heard from 1 Corinthians is that they can become just like that book you've read to your child over and over. We know all the words and yet no longer really pay any attention to what's being said. The passage is so ubiquitous at weddings that this phenomenon was made light of in the movie Wedding Crashers. I never thought I'd be referring to Wedding Crashers in a sermon, but here it is. The two main characters in the movie are played by Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson, and they crash a wedding. And while at the wedding, the priest stands up and invites someone to read the second lesson. And it's then that Owen Wilson's character leans over to Vince Vaughn's and says, $20, it's 1 Corinthians. And Vince Vaughn whispers back, double or nothing, it's Colossians 3:12. At which point the reader begins, and you can predict, and says, and now a reading from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, right? What we heard today. There is no doubt that this passage is easy to gloss over because it feels so familiar to us. And yet it deserves so much more. And so today I want us to try to hear it again for the first time. To notice the way it it presents us with questions of our own understandings of love. To recognize the challenge it issues to those who seek to faithfully follow Jesus. So listen. If I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or rude or arrogant. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. There's a lot to unpack in that. And that wasn't even the whole reading we heard today. At the very least, I think we can say this reflection on love is a reminder that love takes work. It's hard. Love is patient and endures, not because loving others is easy, but because loving others requires our best self, our whole self. First and foremost, I think then making sense of this passage and really making sense of the good news in the gospel as a whole is about trying to understand what Jesus means when he talks about love. One author researching love writes this about it. Virtually all people act and talk as if they have some inkling about love. We speak about loving food and falling in love and loving God and feeling loved and loving a type of music. We say that love hurts and love waits and love stinks and love means never having to say you're sorry. The fact that people talk of love in such varied ways prompted Sigmund Freud to note that love is employed in language in an undifferentiated way. Theologian Mildred Wynkoop, trying to say something similar, goes so far as to say, love is an ambiguous, multifarious weasel word. I like that, right? Love is a weasel word. What do we really mean when we say those words anyway? I think we can all agree that love is hard to precisely define, and yet it's a word we don't want to do without. For our purposes, I think one thing, though, is very clear. What Jesus and the authors of the New Testament meant when they were talking about love is not what we commonly mean today. For the authors of the New Testament, love is not a matter of liking someone or something a lot, nor is it merely a particularly strong emotional attachment to something. There's nothing wrong with these strong emotional attachments. But the problem is if we reduce love to being at its core an emotional state, something we feel, it becomes something we have little control over. Anyone who's been told to just get over it or you should be happy knows how frustrating and infuriating it can be to have someone tell you how you're supposed to feel. In a very real sense, we know that we don't control how we feel. We can't make ourselves happy or force ourselves to like something or someone. And yet, if we don't control what we feel, and love is about being primarily a feeling for someone, then how can we be expected to follow a commandment which calls us to love, which tells us to love? The Bible tells us we have to love. We have to love our enemies, not that we have to like them. See, that's the distinction, one I'm sure you've heard in other places too, but it's important. Because you can dislike someone and yet still love them, still work for their well-being. And so even though we can't always be said to control our emotional states, we do control how we respond to those feelings. And regardless of our feelings, we control how we act. And we're responsible for how we act. Love, as it's used in the New Testament, is then not so much about what we feel. Did you notice that when we heard the Corinthians? It's not really about feelings. It's about what we do. It's a kind of loving action we're called to. In the passage from 1 Corinthians, it's about helping us understand what love really looks like. But notice the reason Paul has to write the letter, of course, is because the Corinthians, they were not actually loving one another as they should, right? They were failing to do this because, as we've said, it's hard. He tells them this to remind them of how God is calling us to act. This is an aspirational statement of what it means to truly love. He says love is patient, and love is kind, and love is not envious or boastful, or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As Christians, then, of course, the first place we look to make sense of what it means to be a people of loving action, enacting that love in the world because we've received that love from God, is the example of Jesus. Jesus' love was not merely an emotional attachment, of course. It was a loving action at its most whole. And it was embodied in the choice he made to give his very life for ours. The words about love in today's reading are given true depth and meaning by his life, death, and resurrection. And to be a people who choose a life defined by loving action is to be a people who follow Christ's example. I know it's been true in my life, and I bet it's been true in yours, and we've talked about this, that even when we fail to find the words to precisely define those parts of our life of faith, words like love, which can be hard to grab a firm hold of, we can point to the example of people whose lives have embodied that loving action for us, who've invited us into understanding what God means when he presents us with that truth. Whether parents or family or friends we've spent countless hours with, or historical figures whose stories have touched us, or profound acts of love we've been blessed to be a witness to, I'm sure we can all name the people who've taught us what it means for love to be patient and kind. And yes, there are also those experiences when we learn all too well what it means for love to become warped into resentfulness and irritability. And we must learn from these failures to love as much as we learn from our successes. Because I think in the end, perhaps the point is not that we need to perfectly love God or perfectly love our neighbor. Again, Paul writes the letter because we failed, right? Because the Corinthians didn't actually live up to that. So I think the point, though, is that we're called to be a people who try to do this, who try to live into this vision of what it can mean for us to live together in the wholeness of what God dreams for us in his world. And I think it's precisely in trying that we become who God calls us to be. And so when we slow down and consider what this passage is all about, we discover that what's at stake is nothing less than answering the question, who is God calling us to be? And Paul's answer is that God is calling us to be a people of loving action. And while that can feel like an awfully hard thing to live up to when you read the details of that passage, we can also hear the angel saying back to us, "Fear not, for God is with us always." And remember, love is in the details. And in conclusion, I'd like to leave you with some words written by the modern mystic Henry Nouwen, because I think he drives home that point in a helpful way, so we don't get lost in the sense of love's grandness, but can remember how it's shown in the everyday, in the small moments and choices we all have an opportunity to make over and over. Nouwen writes this: we choose love by taking small steps of love every time there's an opportunity. A smile, a handshake, a word of encouragement, a phone call, a card and embrace, a kind greeting, a gesture of support, a moment of attention, a helping hand, a present, a financial contribution, a visit. All these are little steps toward love. Each step is like a candle burning in the night. It does not take the darkness away, but it guides us through the darkness. When we look back after many small steps of love, we will discover that we have made a long and beautiful journey. May it be so. In the name of God the Father, and God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Amen.